As you can see, I'm going to give a lecture on tribes today. I have 2 lectures on tribes. Today I will give you a general introduction to the category tribe as we know it in India specifically. And tomorrow I would be basically focusing on tribal movements in India, largely with the idea of understanding the dynamics of tribal society and the sort of changes they have gone through. Tribes by far are one of the most misunderstood categories that we know, not just in India but across the world. And I say this because my PhD research itself has been on tribes. My MPhil was also on tribes. In MPhil I had studied the tribes from Bastar. My PhD was largely on Jharkhand, on South Jharkhand. And despite my years of experience of having worked and researched on tribes, I still sort of consider myself as a student in the way, I try to understand tribal society and the dynamics of tribal society. And I've come across various kinds of stereotypes about tribes, even as I was doing my research. And these are incidences that have actually happened with me, which might seem very strange. But when I used to come back, for a break while doing fieldwork in South Jharkhand, I would be asked by, my friends, my, classmates, whether the Adivasis, as they are known in India, or as the movement, or as the tribal movement wants to refer to themselves as Adivasis, right? So they would ask me, do the Adivasis wear clothes? So I used to be shocked when I used to be asked that, because I was like, hello, they're like you and me. They live in communities, they have very elaborate social and economic organization, they're highly political, and also lived in very close proximity to caste society, right? Not all, but many of the tribal communities in India have stayed in close proximity to caste society. Despite that, there are a lot of stereotypes about tribes in India. So what I'm going to do is probably systematically attempt to present to you some of those stereotypes and also draw your attention to the history that is responsible for creating those stereotypes about tribes. And that history is not specific to India. That history comes from the way in which the Western world or Western Europe has engaged with the rest of the world, especially Asia, Africa, the Pacific, the Americas as it's called, right? The way in which Western Europe looked at what they considered as the other of Western Europe, as the land that they discovered, right? And it also then comes from the specific history within India, right? So there are ways in which there are continuities between the history of the West in the way it has studied tribal communities, and how within India we find parallels of that same conceptualization of tribes, which has only sedimented or consolidated this great divide between tribes and the rest of society in India, which is highly unfortunate. And much of what we have lately heard and seen in Delhi, in other parts, even in Bangalore, where our northeastern students were attacked, it really is a reflection of that deep-rooted bias and prejudice, which is, a product of that historical engagement that the West initiated and has been continued thereafter in India, right? So it's highly deep-rooted to a point where history has become meaningless when we come to look at tribes, and it's almost become natural to consider, northeastern people as different, and tribal people as people who live on trees, and the way in our Bollywood kind of represents tribes hula ha, I mean, you know for a fact that you have a number of students who are coming from tribal communities who are no different from you. And yet there are these deep-rooted stereotypes to the point where it disregards history. It's become naturalized to look upon tribes like that. And I think what this session would try to do, I suppose, is to historicize in the way in which we understand the category tribe, and therefore also demystify who we are talking about, and also bring out the prejudices and biases in the way we look upon tribes, not just in a commonsensical term, but also within the disciplines through which we have understood tribes. And one of the disciplines that has directly engaged in the study of tribes is anthropology, right? And sociology in India, because in India we don't really distinguish between anthropology and sociology, but anthropology is largely associated with the study of so-called primitive societies, societies which the West considered as non-Western societies, societies which were considered as backward, small scale. And that study of such communities was considered as the study of anthropology, right? An anthropological study is largely a study where you go to this remote area, you live among people who are considered as primitive, backward, small scale societies, and come back with some impression about them, which is highly sort of an arrogant depiction of who you think they are, where they themselves have no right to kind of question the representation that you produce of them, right? So anthropology, this obsession of the West, with understanding the rest of the world, colonialism, all sort of comes together in kind of marginalizing the story of tribes in the world. So if you have to talk of tribes, if I have to sum it up in one line, the story of tribes or the history of tribes is nothing but the history of how they have been marginalized as a people, politically, economically, whereas their land and forest resources have been taken over, and culturally, where they are seen as backward and primitive. And much of the tribal movements that you hear of and might be reading, not just in India but in Latin America and other places, is nothing but a way to retrieve a sense of self and dignity in the face of this history of marginalization that they have faced for centuries, right? So having given this backdrop, I want you to give a sympathetic listening to what I'm going to present, which will go into some of the issues that are kind of central in understanding tribes, not just across the world, but also in India, interspersed with certain facts that we need to know about tribes in India, because we see tribes as a very homogeneous lot, while they're not at all homogeneous. And it's fascinating when you go into that, and we'll come to that as we proceed. So as I said, tribes were discovered as a people from 15th century onwards with the discovery of the New World, right? Most of the world served as a laboratory for Europe, not just to comprehend the diversity in the world, but also to assert its cultural superiority. And suddenly they are faced with, people who seem different, who, wear different clothes, whose color is different. Just imagine it, say, in the 15th century or the 16th century. I'm not talking about now. We have people of all colors sitting here. But at that point in time, we were not used to it at all. And suddenly, lo and behold, you kind of come across people who seem very different. And there are lots of films, Hollywood films. I mean, I remember one with Mel Gibson, but I don't remember the name of the movie. I remember him. But in that film, it was very well shown as to how many of these white travelers, missionaries, how they all landed in these tribal communities and gave them gifts like cigars and guns and took over very precious resources from them. And many of these tribal communities have no idea as to what they would do with that. An excellent book if you want to get a sense of how slavery began and how colonization of Africa began, and tribal communities sort of got caught in this slavery trade, which was anyway prevalent before that, but really got rampant, is Alex Haley's book, Roots, where Alex Haley is an American black who's sort of trying to trace his own ancestry, and these are American blacks who have no idea which tribe they belong to. because they were sold as slaves, their families were broken up. Children were separated from parents, and they were sent to these various plantations to work in, right? And so the only time he mentions, no, that's different. That's different one, yeah. So he really talks about how, you know, it was only in the evenings when all the women of that plantation would sit together, and very often they were not even related to each other, and they would start narrating about how it was and what their grandfather told them how life was back, you know, in their native place. And that kind of triggered an interest in him to really understand his roots, as to where he comes from, who he is, what is. So he finally in that book traces his roots back to Kenya, and he realizes that he's actually a Muslim from Kenya, from a tribe. But here he was a Christian. He was brought up in America, and he was converted, and whatever. He was born a Christian because his mother was a Christian. And he sort of has this bonding with his tribe. He actually reaches back to that tribe. He does a lot of research and goes back to that tribe. And in that book he describes, I read it a long time back, but one thing that I remember very clearly in that is when he says that, you know, his grandmother, whoever kind of narrated that when the white landed up in, you know, their native place where they were staying, that when they saw the whites, they thought they were ghosts. And I'm sure that's not, you know, very kind of complimentary to whites, because whites are seen as people who are colorless, right? Whereas the blacks are seen as who are colored. And if you were to ask blacks, they'll say, well, we are privileged, we are colored. Those people are pale, they're like ghosts, right? So you get a completely different perception in the way in which tribes look upon, you know, the Westerners or the dominant community who came and kind of took over their land and resources. So that book is excellent to really get a sense of how marginalized people talk of their history or their experiences and how they build their identities. So anyway, so the point is that around the 15th and 16th century, you find missionaries, travelers, all going to Africa, Asia, Pacific, writing on tribes. And that's the time when there was this great desire to understand the diversity they saw around the world, because if you're not, you know, there was this complete denial of the origin of human beings. And in order to create a secular history, the idea was, how do you comprehend this diversity that you see around you? Now, there are two principal ideas that dominated in building a universal history of mankind, right? Across differences and diversity that they saw. One was the idea of progress. The idea of progress is basically a belief that civilization is moving towards a desirable direction. And what is that desirable direction? That desirable direction is towards how the West had progressed. So the West considered itself as the most evolved, the most conscious, because it was a society which had sort of, you know, celebrated, you know, human ingenuity. It had celebrated human's capacity to master nature, to be able to recognize his or her own power, to kind of, you know, use nature for the betterment of humankind. So technology was far more advanced. There was this desire to abandon religion and really developed humanism, where you depend on your rational thinking to conduct your social and economic organization. So there was a sort of a celebration of, you know, in the West about the way their civilization was progressing, and much of what they saw was nothing but stages of evolution. So the second idea was of social evolution. One was progress, the other was social evolution. That all these societies, tribal societies that they saw were in stages which the West had already passed. So they were remnant of the stages of the West as they were. So then in that process, these communities served as laboratories for the Westerners. So many psychologists, ethnobotanists, you know, sociologists, anthropologists, ethnologists, all of them landed up in these communities to really grapple and understand these simple societies to get a sense of how Western society might have evolved. So one of the famous cases within anthropology that we discuss all the time is that of an American anthropologist called Margaret Mead. She had done her work among the Samoa, you know, a tribal community, a remote tribal community, and she had gone there, she was a psychologist, and she had gone there to really with the intention to understand adolescent behavior among the Samoan youth. And this she had done because there were a lot of psychological problems that many of the adolescents in the West were facing. Issues of sexuality, there was sort of depression and, you know, clinical conditions that many of the Western youth were facing, American youth were facing, and she really thought that going to a simple society will help her understand how best to comprehend human nature, because it's in the simplest form in these communities. And her study was later thoroughly criticized for kind of using this evolutionary frame. Of course, all of these theories got later challenged, but initially at that point in time, tribes really emerged as a category to explain West's obsession with its past in the quest to construct the universal history of mankind, right? So tribe really now are subserving Western needs. It is less about tribes. It's more about the West. It tells you very little about who they are. When I was doing a research, I did a secondary literature search of all that literature there was on Central Indian tribes, and frankly, I didn't understand anything. Because all it told you was what they were not. What they actually were was nothing but negative kind of features highlighted. So this was nothing but a Western obsession with how they wanted to see tribal communities. So tribes represented the various stages of development that Western societies had already gone through in the past. Tribes were the primitive other, yet to be civilized, near to nature. They were childlike, according to the Westerners. You know, there's this example of the Ho, the community that I had researched, where in 1901, in one of the census kind of gazetteers, one of the British officials talks about the Ho being very innocent, in that somebody had accused him of theft, this particular Ho gentleman of theft, and he apparently was very upset with that, and he knew who actually was the thief. So he went apparently and cut off this man's head and brought it to this official to show that he's your culprit. It's not me. And so the description, what is more horrendous than the act of cutting the head is the way in which the British official explains it, saying that, see, here is an innocent man who has no control over his emotions, but very honest to the core. So in order to prove himself not guilty, he goes and innocently, you know, cuts the head of this man and gives it to me. So that was his way of showing that they are very near to nature, that they are not cultured, they are not civilized, they're barbaric, right? And therefore need to be protected. So this whole idea of the civilizing mission is somewhere connected to that. You know, so British, I will come to that policy that the British followed when it came to India. But this is a fine example of how tribes were seen as, you know, children in this, you know, entire quest for civilizational growth, right? So tribes were associated with small-scale societies, undifferentiated, homogeneous, animistic. Animistic, you know the meaning of animistic? Right? When you worship nature and animals and trees, and you sort of see, you know, something divine in them, and you see them, you see them as having spirits. Hinduism was also described as animistic by the British when they first landed in India, with a distinct language and with a low level of technology. So what the study of tribe did, and mind you, we are suffering from that even now, right, in the 21st century, is that there was a denial of contemporariness, or what is called, there was an allochronistic understanding of tribes that emerges. So you kind of don't see tribes as contemporary society. You see them in a time gone by. You don't see them as contemporaries, but these were contemporary societies. So you see societies spread out in space as those spread out in time. So tribes have been suffering from this allochronism, as it is called. You know, the study of tribes has suffered from this. Not just then, but even now, where we refuse to see them as a part of this century, as people who are dealing with, you know, circumstances and conditions which are very contemporary and not something in the past. They are different, probably, but they are not from the past. But somehow we associate them as people who are jungly, right? People who are living in the jungle, who live in, you know, in another age altogether. But that is not the case. And that actually somewhere sums up the way in which study of tribe has been done, not just in the West, but also in India. So there were two schools of thought that dominated the study of tribes. One was the evolutionist, and the other was the romantics. Now, while there was a general consensus on tribes as primitive, Western scholars were divided on how to view tribal society in relation to the progress made by the Western world, right? So the evolutionists held the view that tribal societies were backward, barbarous, uncultured, and therefore the Western world had the responsibility of socializing them into civilization. So the idea is that the whites took on this whole white man's burden, you know, onto them, and the fact that they needed to civilize this whole lot in the progress of humankind, and obviously considered tribes as inferior and backward, right? So this is just a depiction of, this is called misanthropology, not anthropology, because now this is actually sort of a take on the way in which anthropology was conducted, where this observer, who's very distant from the people that he's studying, saying, my observation of this culture reinforced my belief that people everywhere share certain basic characteristics in that they are base, vulgar, crude, stupid, and totally without any redeeming mentality. So there was a way in which all tribes finally were associated with certain basic characteristics like this. So they were homogenized, you know, completely homogenized, and seen as people who need to be reformed. And it was the burden of the Westerners to really reform much of the world. The Romantics, who were disturbed by the rapid changes that characterized the West, sought a return to innocence in the simple life that characterized tribal society. I don't know how many of you have heard of David Thoreau, somebody who also inspired Gandhi a lot, right? He's somebody who spoke, who kind of very critical of industrialization. And there were a whole lot, of course, among them there were various strands. There were the conservatives who felt that industrialization was breaking into their privileges from what they had derived from the feudal setup. Yet there were also those who were actually genuinely concerned what industrialization was doing to the Western world, mechanization was doing to the Western world, social relationships were becoming distant, you know, family life was dissociated from professional life. There were a whole lot of changes that were taking place, and many were not comfortable with that change and actually craved for more life in rhythm with nature, something that sort of respects, you know, how, you know, when you live, especially like agriculture, whatever said and done, agriculture life beyond a point, however much you mechanize, somewhere has to follow the rhythm of nature. We try to tamper with the rhythm of nature by bringing up, you know, mechanization or bringing up hybrid seeds, and these are ways in which you kind of cut into the rhythm of nature. But still, you know, somewhere agriculture is forced to respect that. But industrialization somewhere is about how the rate of production has to outdo the rate of reproduction. Right? So much of the ecological crisis that we talk of at this point in time is a product of this, you know, big thing about industrialization, that the rate of production is much faster than the rate of reproduction of nature. And that is what's creating sort of a crisis, right? So many of the ecologists, as we know them now, are very sympathetic to this view. So the romantic view still persists and finds a lot of followers. But at that point in time, tribes really kind of symbolize this very kind of romantic vision of living one with nature and, you know, respecting nature, leading a spiritual life, a largely moral life. So they sought a state near to nature, uncomplicated, community-based as an alternative to the Western world's incessant desire for material progress and growth, because there were many who really didn't understand what was the logic of that material growth and progress that was being sought in the West, where it was leading to greater polarization of people and pauperization among them. They couldn't understand for whom was this material growth and progress. So these conceptions inform the study of tribes. So the tribes were really kind of sort of divided into these two schools of thought, where one kind of sort of wanted to kind of essentialize tribe as this people near to nature, people who need to be conserved, whose way of life should be protected. And there were those who felt, no, they are barbaric, they are primitive, we need to civilize them. So this is, you know, there are these natives who basically are watching, obviously have TV and other electronic gadgets, they have telephones with them, and they actually see an anthropologist walking in and they say, anthropologist, anthropologist, and they begin to hide all this. So even now, for example, if you were to go to Ooty, right? I don't know whether you've heard of the tribe Todas, right? There's a lot of ethnic tourism that happens now, right? If you go among the Todas, they still, for the sake of tourists, will wear these shawls and, you know, live in these huts, and you'll feel very great about. You'll go to Rajasthan, you'll have, you know, the nomadic tribes coming and in their costumes and dancing with you, and, you know, you have their bhakri, and you feel great about it, and you feel, wah, ye life hai. So, you know, there is a way, and obviously they might be the ones who will then change and, you know, probably be in their pants, and they say, okay, I'll take my money and my, you know, my work is over, right? So tourism has sort of capitalized on that. So even now, probably the anthropologist doesn't do that anymore. Anthropologist has wisened up. But I think the economics of all this has led to sort of growth of tourism. You go to any place in Southeast Asia, wherever, you find this sort of, you know, essentialization of tribal life. So finally, if you were to then, who are tribes? If you were to finally ask this question, there were two features that were associated with tribes, right? They were seen as primitive, and in that they were seen as conceptually the opposite of the West and the opposite of the civilized. So not just of the West, but also of the civilized. So when this discourse comes to India, very nicely it is adopted to see, you know, the dominant Indian culture as the civilized culture, and tribes as those who are uncivilized. So you'll find that when we come to India. So they were primarily described in terms of a lack, right? Promiscuous, animistic, prehistoric, simple and untutored, half-clad, poverty of language, black like crow, akin to the Nishadas. Nishadas are who? They are actually Nishadas, they mention in our mythological texts in India. The Rakshasas, the Nishadas, right? So they're seen as the people of the night, not people of the day. These are people who live in the jungle. So Ghatoj Kach, for example, will be a part of that. Many interpretations of the Mahabharata will tell you that actually the people who are mentioned as people living in the jungle are tribal people, right? But they're represented in that manner. I just want to touch upon Africa a little. So writing on Africa, just to tell you how there are parallels in the way in which tribes were studied, not just in India, but also in Africa. So Aidan Southall is somebody who kind of has written this, who's made a case to really not use the word tribe at all. He says tribe is a very abused word. The moment you use tribe, these sort of stereotypes kind of come up in our head. We should call them ethnic groups. We should not call them tribes. We should call them ethnic group. So he demonstrates how the colonialists, largely the French and the British, were unable to define the boundaries of a tribe, right? Because in Africa, I'm sure you did stateless society when you did kinship. Mawa must have mentioned it. Africa was largely seen, there were large parts of Africa which had no notion of a state. even in interiors of India, tribal areas, if you go, there was no notion of a state. They were lineage-based organizations, societies which were organized around lineage and kinship, right? And there were innumerable groups, thousands and thousands of groups. And the Westerners or, the colonialists really couldn't make sense of that. And I suppose because of the compulsion of governance, they needed to understand what was happening. Tribes were named after plants, animals, trees, but they did not share any particular political and social characteristic as a collective, right? So you find languages across and within groups. So there was this one tribe which is called the Murgin tribe. And within that tribe, you had clans which had different languages, right? And then there was this tribe called the Tiv, which the British identified them as the Tiv. But you had among the Tiv those, there were people who were not Tiv who would derive ancestry from Tiv. So whereas the British and the French gave certain political identity for the sake of governance to them, they really could not comprehend the sort of semi-autonomous groups that there were in Africa, right? So another example is of the Dinka tribe. You heard of the Nua? Mawa did it when you did kinship. Now the Nua have always been warring with the Dinka. Dinka is the tribe which comes from the same area. And there are hundreds of tribes which are among Dinka. And among those tribes, you have another 25, 6, 27 number of tribes. So it is almost like tribe within a tribe within a tribe within a tribe, which is then called Dinka, right? Similarly, the Yoruba. Yoruba actually consists of many tribal groups, but were given a name Yoruba in Nigeria because they belong to a particular area of Africa, of Nigeria. So just in terms of territorially kind of making sense of the number of tribes, they were given one common kind of name called Yoruba. So what I'm trying to say here is that when the British, when the French, when the colonialists tried to understand tribal communities, they couldn't make sense of it. That's the first time, there are these number of books in anthropology that comes out in the 1930s and 40s trying to understand the political and social organization of tribes, especially in Africa. Because these were societies which were absolutely functional, efficient, operational, which did not have a notion of a state. How is order possible in these communities or in these territories where there is no sort of a political organization that you are familiar with? So they were an enigma. Tribes have always been an enigma. They are people, that's why I call them, people call tribes as marginalized people. I call them frontier people. Tribes are people who challenge the sense of order that those who represent the dominant society, have of the world. So what we think is order, you find a completely different set of order there. And there has been a struggle constantly to understand what that order is. Now I come to India. Now in India, there has always been a tension between an anthropological definition and an administrative definition of tribes. The administrative definition of tribe is based on enumeration alone, right? Is less attentive to the subjective dimension of tribal identity, interested in identification of tribes as against tribes in terms of their socio-cultural and economic features. So there are certain objective criteria on which they will try and identify tribes, and less to do with the subjective or how the tribes themselves perceive who they are. So it's a very objective exercise meant for governance, for the sake of making sense of the large diversity there is in India, and largely kind of motivated by the development zeal of the Indian government, right? Because now we have sort of provisions for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. It has become like a regular exercise of census of India to really understand, have their numbers increased, have their numbers decreased, and what are the sort of provisioning that is required for them. So there is a regular exercise that happens by the government of India. right? But largely the question has been, who are tribes? In the context of India, it has basically kind of gone back and forth on these aspects. One, are they caste? Are they peasants? Are they a separate society? Very different from Hindu society or any other society, right? Are they a stage of evolution as the Westerners would have us believe? Are they a stateless society? Or are they indigenous? To say that if you go by the Aryan theory, then are they pre-Aryan? Now these have been sort of some of the questions that have come up, and I'll come to those later. So the British, now I come to colonialism, how British sort of tried to understand tribes, right? So the British, through different census operations, laid the formal, the official distinction between caste and tribe. And mind you, it has been a slow process. They obviously struggled as in Africa, they struggled to understand who tribes were. There were very blurred boundaries between caste and tribe that you find in India, right? So the 1881 census classifies tribes as forest tribes within the category of agriculture and pastoral castes, right? So still the distinction between tribe and caste is not clear. 1901-11 census, Risley and Gate. Risley is the one who came up with the racial theory of caste, if you remember, I talked about it. They termed tribes as animists, people who worship, you know, nature in its various forms. But then that didn't say much, because Hindus were animists too, and are animists too, right? So 1931 census replaced the term animist with tribal religion. So progressively you see how there's been an effort to distinguish caste society from tribal society. Now the confusion over caste and tribe really got resolved for the British, not with any sort of clarity or systematic study that they did, but really that clarity really comes from the experience of governing tribal communities. I think the maximum number of resistance that they faced initially when they came to India was from tribal communities, right? And it's in that process that they cordoned off large part of tribal areas. For example, in the northeast, the excluded area and the partially excluded area came up. Much of Arunachal and all of that was part of excluded area, and the partially excluded area was the rest of the northeast. They came up with non-regulation tracts, where the regulations that were kind of prevalent in other parts of India were not prevalent in these areas. And they came up with all that because there was tremendous resistance on the part of tribal communities to the sort of administration that they wanted to introduce, because they wanted to bring in their land and forest administration. They had divided forests into these three kinds. They had the reserve forest and the protected forest and the village forest, and denied all access to these forests to the tribals. And the tribals were forced to pay grazing tax, stuff that they was a part of their life, normal part of life, the taken for granted part of their life. Suddenly the British came and imposed all of that. British also brought in private ownership of land. You know, they came up with number of settlements in tribal area. The Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act came up. Many of these acts came and sort of privileged certain people in those communities. Stratification emerged in those communities. There was a whole lot of upheaval that happened. So it's in that process the British sort of cordoned off large parts of tribal area for the sake of governance, and that put in place or fixed this distinction between tribe and caste. Post-independence. Post-independence, what happens? 342, Article 342(1) says the President may, with respect of any state or union territory, by public notification, specify the tribes or tribal communities or parts of or groups within tribes or tribal communities which shall for the purposes of this Constitution be deemed to be scheduled tribes in relation to the state or union territory, as the case may be. The part 2 of it says Parliament may by law include or exclude under clause 1 of any tribe or tribal community or part of or group within any tribe or tribal community, right? So it basically boiled down to the President notifying and the Parliament denotifying whether a community is considered tribe or not. And much of the politics that you see of enumeration of tribes in India is really a fallout of this. So there are many communities in India who are still struggling to get a to get a tribal status. For example, the Badaga tribe, very famous, has been written a lot about by colonialists and referred to by a person like Thurston, who was one of the first people to document caste and tribes in South India. Badaga tribe is not considered as tribe, as scheduled tribe, and they're still struggling for that status. Whereas there is another community which is actually akin to caste, which recently got a tribal status, right? So there's a whole lot of politicking that happens. Similarly, a tribe called the Siddhi tribe. Siddhi tribe is the only tribe that I know of African origins in India. I don't know if you have ever seen them. They're largely, you'll find them along the west coast. They're in Goa, they're in Mangalore, they're also in North Karnataka, right? They're spread out and they belong to various religions. There are Hindus among them, there are Muslims, there are Christians among them, and they're spread across. They got a scheduled tribal status in 2003, and that too with area restriction. Area restriction is that they only can enjoy that status of a scheduled tribe in the area that they are dominant. So there were certain areas that were identified where they were dominant. So if a Siddhi were to move from, say, that region of Karnataka, Mangalore, and goes to Bangalore, will not be able to kind of use that privilege. So they are still fighting. And they're a highly stigmatized community because of their color, because they are, you can spot them from a distance. They look different. They definitely look black, right? So they have curly hair and they look very different, and therefore also kind of kept away from caste society in a big way. I don't know whether you've gone to Uttara Kannada. Should go, it's a beautiful stretch, but largely you find, you will be able to see them there. And many of them are, working as, among them also you have people who are government officers, administrative officers, they're into sports in a big way. And in fact, the Indian government is trying to kind of bring in interest of sports, again going by a racial understanding that as blacks they will have greater kind of stamina and they'll do as well as American blacks do, and so there's this training program that happens, and basketball and all of that, so that started. And even in Gujarat, they've been used in a big way for tourism, right? So they've been used in various ways. So there's a whole sort of politics around this enumeration of tribes that is taking place in India, which is very, very problematic. In fact, there is this particular article which I'm not going to circulate, but if you're interested, you should go to JSTOR. It's available in JSTOR, by Laura Jenkins, Jenkins, and she talks about how the entire census exercise happens. So one of the key figures of the Anthropological Survey of India in bringing out this whole scheduled caste, scheduled tribe encyclopedia and the series has been K.S. Singh, a very famous anthropologist, administrative anthropologists. Much of the anthropologists in India, like me, we do very, very kind of insignificant work actually, because we do very micro level studies. It is people like K.S. Singh who have that authority and the power, who are part of the Anthropological Survey of India. He was president for almost like 3 times president. And he has conducted many of these series, caste and tribe series. So she had kind of associated herself with K.S. Singh to understand this entire process. So she calls this entire exercise of understanding caste and tribe in India as portrait building. She says it's portrait building. You build a portrait of tribes in India, caste in India. You give these, objective features and say these many tribes, this is the population, and largely for developmental requirements. And she says there were 600 investigators who cross entire India to collect information of tribe. And you can imagine the sort of confusion those 600 investigators might be doing, not just in terms of the ignorance, but also the prejudices and biases they might kind of bring to it. And the politics that it unfolds, it's tremendous, because these are local officials, local investigators who go into these areas and seek information, right? So she says there are 600 investigators in the study of 4,693 communities. Can you imagine? 4,693 communities, 24,951 interviews, that many interviews. And God knows how they process those interviews. And over about almost 5,000 photographs, portraits. So you'll have, different tribes posing and kind of to claim their tribal status, and you have to be in your kind of conventional wear. I mean, nobody can pose in jeans. You have to be in your conventional wear if you want to be considered as tribe, as a serious tribal. Then you have to be in your kind of, regular costume, which I suppose none of us have to be. If we have to really talk about, I mean, I can say I am from this place, you can say you're a Bengali, you can say, but not really bother about what you're wearing, your identity is not going to be questioned. But in the case of tribes, somehow there is an effort to push tribes into, the stereotyping that we have of them.